prominently. Talk a little bit about digital imaging now. We certainly use both grids and something similar to a screen in digital imaging. Really, the advantages of digital imaging, right? We can be viewing images at multiple sites. We've mentioned the fact that they have a wider dynamic range. They're not contrast limited. It decouples the recording, the displaying, and archiving tasks, right? It used to be you had one piece of film. The image was recorded on that piece of film. You had to read that piece of film. That piece of film was stored in a jacket for archival purposes. Right now, multiple people can all be looking at the image simultaneously, kind of thing. People thought it would lead to higher patient throughput and decreased dose. Sometimes some of the things you think might happen don't quite happen there quite as well. Unfortunately, it really required a lot of new, expensive equipment, and so it took a while, and there was kind of a natural transition from film to CR, and now to some of these more direct digital systems, because CR most really closely matched what was previously being done with film, and so it was kind of a natural progression there. We need some high-speed networks, of course. Some of these images require a tremendous amount of bandwidth. And they do have decreased spatial resolution compared to film. And some people thought that may be prohibitive in terms of their use, but that really hasn't been the case as we've gotten better and better resolution digital imaging systems. Still not quite the same as screen film, but getting closer to doing that. There's a number of different digital detectors that are out there, some gas detectors, and if anyone has a volume zoom, one of the old Siemens 4-row CT scanners, that actually was one of the last things that had xenon gas detectors in it. But more likely they're either crystal, scintillators, or phosphors that we'll talk about, or they're solid-state semiconductor, amorphous selenium detectors, and I'll mention those in a second. A gas detector is pretty simple. X-ray comes in, interacts with the xenon gas here, liberates some charge, and we just measure the amount of charge is proportional to the X-ray energy that was detected. Crystals and solid-state detectors, there's a number of them that we'll hear and talk about in different imaging. Sodium iodide, cesium iodide, bismuth germanium oxide, and in PET, barium fluorobromide. In atoms, we talked about electrons existing in that shell configuration. In crystals, they're shared and they exist in these band configurations. And solid-state crystals have special properties between their inner band, their valence band, and their outer band, their conduction band. And it turns out that photons can transfer energy to those inner band electrons and move them up to those outer bands. That electron may immediately fall back down into its valence band and give off a little bit of electromagnetic energy in the kind of the visible light range. And things that do that immediately, that return immediately and immediately give that light off, are called scintillators, right? And things which take a little bit more time to do that are called phosphors. So scintillators and phosphors are very similar things. It's just the timing at which it takes for those outer band electrons to move back down to those valence bands. In some phosphors, those electrons that move to that outer band are pretty stable sitting in that outer band, and they'll stay there for a fairly significant period of time. And we can help that process out, help move them back down into the inner band by inputting some energy into the system. And those are called photostimulable phosphors, and those are what CR, computed radiography plates, use. So let's look at that a little bit. Scintillators, we're going to see a lot about scintillators in nuclear medicine, right? X-ray photon comes in, as soon as it interacts in the scintillator, it converts that high energy X-ray photon energy into multiple visible light photons. Very similar to the screens, right? Screens are made out of a scintillator material that I talked about. Here's a photostimulable phosphor, right? X-ray energy comes in, it moves some of those things from that inner to that outer band, some of those electrons there, and it stays there fairly stable. And then we can use a laser light to stimulate that region on this phosphor, and lo and behold, we get this production of a lot of lower energy photons, visible light. In other materials, right, I want to move away now from scintillators and phosphors called photoconductors. That X-ray energy is directly converted to electrons, the flow of current. So that X-ray energy is directly converted through to current. We don't need this intermediate, lower energy photons, visible light kind of photons. And those are called photoconductors, and I'll show you an example, some of those. Computed radiography, when you hear the term, really refers to imaging using photostimulable phosphors, okay? And digital radiography, when used appropriately, includes CR as well as digital imaging performed with various other types of detectors, like photoconductors, and I'll show you that example in a while. I think I've said all of this about photostimulable phosphor, so I don't think we need to go over that again. The thing I want to emphasize at the end here is that the amount of light that gets emitted is proportional to the exposure at that particular point on the plate. So that determines that how much light we get there, right, determines how bright that point on the phosphor is going to end up being in the image that we create. The phosphor at the end is then erased with an intense white light because in truth, as you stimulate the phosphor, some of those electrons have stayed in the outer band, and you now want to move them all back to the inner band before you use the plate again. Otherwise, you end up with a little bit of a double exposure. Okay. You've got to process that plate within a reasonable amount of time. If you go take a radiograph with a CR plate and wait 8 hours, the image quality is going to degrade quite a bit because some of those electrons are going to move on their own from the conduction back into the valence band. And so after about 8 hours, the image quality is degraded to the extent the image isn't really usable. And just like film, photostimulable phosphors can be double exposed, right? The tech can accidentally take another image on top of the first one, and you can have a double exposure. So here's screen film foot radiographs, right? Low exposure, mid exposure, high exposure. And one of the big benefits of CR is, like we said, that more uniform response, really, that linear response across a wide range of exposures. When CR was first introduced to the workflow, it was very similar to the screen film workflow, right? You expose the CR plate, you pop the plate into the reader. Back then, they even digitized a film of it. Now that would just get sent to PACS after the plate was read. And that film was delivered to the reading room, and the film was archived after reading. So it was a nice natural replacement for film. It didn't require everything just be thrown out the door, if you will. Once adequate PACS, archiving systems, and networks were available, now you could expose, read the CR plate, and transmit that digitized image. And I'm sure most of you do a lot of that today. By the way, CR still predominates, although that's changing very rapidly. Direct digital imaging, I think, is going to supplant indirect digital imaging with CR, photostimulable phosphors, pretty soon, and has already in certain areas. So digital radiography, CR plus some other things. In indirect systems, we convert those X-rays into an electronic signal by first converting them to lower energy light photons, right? In direct digital radiography systems, we're going to convert those X-rays directly into an electrical signal or current. Now, some of you probably said, I've got a beautiful CCD camera on my cell phone these days. Why don't we use a similar thing and just put that on the backside of the patient and take a picture there? And the reason for that is those amorphous silicon, those transistor-type CCDs, those charge-coupled device arrays, have no stopping power for high-energy X-rays, right? So that kind of system doesn't work. You really need an indirect system in order to make that work. Well, you'll convert that energy from high energy to low energy and then detect. So beautiful image from the physics modules online, right? Here's film screen. Here are the indirect techniques. Here is CR that we've talked about, where you have the storage phosphor, you stimulate it, then you've got to do the readout, right? And the readout, that charged coupled device, like a camera almost in your cell phone, if you will, takes an image of that light that's being read out when we stimulate the phosphor. There's another indirect that uses a scintillator, right, instead of a phosphor, and some of the flat panel detector systems use this. Remember, these give off light immediately. You don't stimulate them. So they're not useful for going and doing a portable X-ray and coming back down to read that, right? The image has to be read off as it's being exposed, if you will. And that's still done. That high energy X-ray light is converted to this visible light that's read then by a amorphous silicon or thin film transistor array CCD camera. We're going to talk a little bit about direct digital, where now these X-rays directly interact with some amorphous selenium, higher Z than silicon, amorphous selenium detector, thin film transistor array. And I'm not going to talk anything about direct photon counting devices, but that's the next generation of what we're going to see. So here's computed radiography. We already talked about it. I'm just going to leave the picture there for your reference. Indirect DR with a thin film transistor array. Thin film transistor arrays, it can be read out much quicker than a CCD array in terms of camera, and I won't go into why that's the case, but that's one of the reasons we like those better, especially on things where a flat panel fluoro system where we need images sometimes in a fairly quick succession to each other. The disadvantages compared to a CCD is less of the surface area of those are photosensitive, so they're going to detect less of the visible light. And I've shown you that they can be used in both indirect and direct. You saw the amorphous silicon and the amorphous selenium ones in that picture. So here's that indirect using a scintillator. We've got that photodiode, and then we've got our array reading that out. And here's direct digital, where the X-rays strike this photoconductor, and then we've got that array just below that. And what's really nice about this is the X-ray comes in, and now instead of producing lower energy electromagnetic light phenomenon, it releases charge in this material. It releases electrons in that material. And if we put a little bias voltage, positive voltage here, negative voltage here, the electrons will move in one direction, and the hole, if you will, the space that the electron left, will move directly down to the thin film transistor array. So unlike our scintillators and our phosphors and our screens, we don't get that spreading out of the light like we did there. This electron moves to the closest, linearly down to the closest point onto that thin film transistor array. So nice resolution properties here. I'm going to show you cesium iodide and why we use it in some of the flat panel detector IIs, digital detectors, because it helps eliminate some of that spreading of the light that we talked about. And I think I put that picture here. Does everyone see that cesium iodide grows in these beautiful needle-like projections? Unfortunately, they're very delicate. But what's nice about that is when light comes in and strikes one of those, the light that's created there, that scintillates from there, travels right down that needle and can't spread too much out laterally from that point. So it helps to have some, improve some of the resolution properties. So scintillators and photoconductors, right? Photoconductors most often used in direct flat panel detectors are selenium-based. So the Z is 34, the K edge about 13. Now we've talked about if we could match the K edge to the average X-ray energy that we're imaging with, that would be a really good thing, right? Because our probability of interaction would be much higher. And this is 13 kV is much too low, right? We'd really like to get that up into the 30, 40, 50, 60 keV range to really match that nicely to the K, the mean energy being produced when we do fluoroscopic imaging, let's say with 80 kVp across the X-ray tube. So newer materials are being developed that use, cadmium telluride with a little bit of dope with a little bit of zinc, mercury iodide, lead iodide, and that have a higher K edge. And I think we'll see those come into introduction, right? We'll have better efficiency of stopping those X-rays and converting them to electrical current. CR photostimulable phosphors are great for portable exams. You take them up, image them, bring them back. They have a really wide dynamic range. Digital systems allow for the image to be viewed immediately at multiple locations. And we used to say CR was nice for those portables, you know, you go up, shoot them, bring it back down, those kind of things. DR systems, well, cesium iodide, that's very delicate crystal, but now if you go to some of these photoconductor materials like amorphous selenium, they're not as delicate, and so you can make a portable plate to go with. And now with wireless technology, you can make a digital plate, right, take it up to the ICU, and once it's exposed, have that data be transmitted from the plate itself wirelessly to the network in the hospital, so you can have it in your reading room before the tech basically even leaves the patient's room. And that's where we're starting to be, and definitely where we're going to be a few years down the road. Okay, so this is not so true anymore. These systems are kind of